Welcome to Coaching Revealed, the podcast brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. In this episode, we're highlighting a keynote address from the Institute of Coaching's 2024 annual conference featuring Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia, the founder and director of the Institute for Trauma-Informed Systems Change at McLean Hospital. Dr. Moreland-Capuia emphasizes that safety isn't just psychological, it encompasses financial, physical, and spiritual safety. Defining trauma not by type, but by its neurobiological underpinnings, a fear-stress response that doesn't quite turn off. Dr. Moreland-Capuia introduces several practical frameworks for creating trauma-informed spaces. She distinguishes between success, or hitting the target once, and mastery, which is improving accuracy over time while accepting imperfection. For trauma-informed systems, striving for perfect commitment is more sustainable than perfection. She also emphasizes that organizations, like people, can be traumatized and can heal, particularly when given space to grow. For individuals and organizations looking to be trauma-informed, Alisha shares how to start asking what you need to feel safe to do your job, and then to model this behavior for others. Dr. Moreland-Capuia reminds listeners that the more we talk about safety, the better we can become at building the conditions for it. And now, our keynote with Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm a mover, and we're going to be in conversation this morning. So if you didn't get your second jolt of coffee, now will be the time to do so, because we are going to be in conversation. I want to thank Carol for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for your leadership. Thank Jeff, who it was good to see 3D today. Many thanks to Dr. Chris Palmer. And many thanks to each of you for allowing me this next 55 minutes to really share space with you. It is no surprise, it is not lost on me that I'm among experts. And so what we're going to do richly today is I'm going to tap into our shared collective expertise. I'm going to honor that because it'll make this next 55 minutes richer. We're going to do some practical things, but as my grandmother said, information is only as good as it is useful. So I want you to leave here today with at least one or two things that you think you can employ from our conversation today. I work in this sort of niche area called trauma-informed systems change. And so I want to share with you my goal today is I've come with an offering. And an offering, as just as it is that I want to share with you what I know, what I have been able to do for the last 22 years that has demonstrated significant success across multiple platforms. So I work and do a bunch of coaching. So I work clinically. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you is not just academic, but I still very much see patients and facilitate the healing of individuals and families and communities. And then I also work with organizations, Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies, community-based organizations, and just recently finished working with a 19,000-member organization, helping them over an 18-month period become trauma-informed. So what I'm sharing with you is practical, and there's lots to, I think, be gleaned from it. So with that being said, are we ready to get started? So I'm going to talk to you about what it means to be trauma-informed and why it really becomes there's an urgent call for today. So I'll start this way. About 6 months ago, I was on my way back from the Pacific Northwest, which is absolutely beautiful. Also happens to be my hometown of Oregon. I was on my way back from, yes to Oregon. Yes to Tillamook cheese, yes to hiking, yes to the Pacific Crest Trail, but lest I digress. So I was on my way back, and it was the weather was particularly turbulent. I mean, like horribly turbulent, to the point where I had to kind of say a little prayer and say, I know one day I'm going to have to meet my maker, but this is not the way I want to go. And it wasn't until, it was exceptionally turbulent, and it wasn't until I got to relative safety that I recognized what the pilot did during that significant turbulence. The pilot didn't go lower. The pilot actually went higher. And I started to think about sort of where we are metaphorically, and you've heard some of the speakers talk about sort of the geopolitical trauma and the geopolitical atmosphere that we find ourselves in. But I'm still holding out the hope. It's the one thing that I cannot afford to abandon, that there is indeed a higher place that we all can go to And I'm hoping that this talk today will represent, metaphorically for you, a higher place. Partly because I know that the work that you do as outwardly facing servants of others, that as you are working to facilitate the healing and the wholeness of others, that it is just as important that you are also healed and working on your healing, and you are also working towards your wholeness. So I'm going to support you in that today. It's the gift that will continue to give. And so I'm going to talk, yes, when we talk about what it means to be trauma-informed, what really is going to undergird that conversation are things like connection and love. And we're going to talk about the neuroscience of those things and why they're so incredibly important in the work I do and the work that I hope you will want to do. These are our goals. We're going to talk about the neuroscience briefly of fear, stress, and trauma. I want to discuss safety, belonging, and healing. And I will also get a little into mattering. Preletensky and colleagues have a whole body of literature on it, and I want to tell you about sort of what that really means, practically speaking, not just from a scientific perspective. And then talk about trauma-informed leadership in organizations and healing, and again, leave you with at least one thing that you can do before we leave here. I was recently looking at a LinkedIn post, and this was a question that was asked. It's not my post, so I want to give proper credit. It's not mine, but this is what I read. That a 5-year-old girl or 5-year-old child was asked, "What is love?" And the 5-year-old child's response was, "Love is when I lose my front teeth and my friends still love me, even though a part of me is missing." Indeed. Sit with that. That is the work that trauma-informed systems change embodies. That we have missing parts, that we come wounded but ready to do the work. And there's a recognition of our own humanity in the processes of us trying to help others tap into theirs. All right, so here's where it starts. Safety. Whether we are conscious of it or not, when you all first walked into this room, the first thing you did was appraise whether or not you were in a safe space, whether or not you could be safe. And I could tell you that it is almost a daily, minute-by-minute endeavor for us assessing whether or not we are in safe spaces. We not only need safety, we require it, we're seeking it. We need to feel safe, we need to be safe, and it is something that we all deserve. So I want you to take a look at this brain and essentially the way that the brain develops, which I'm fascinated by. I've always loved the brain and how it works. It just makes sense, structurally, functionally. But the brain develops from the bottom up, the inside out, and from the back to the front. And it turns out, just for all intents and purposes, this is the bottom part of the brain is really for survival, right? It's where our hearts beat, we're breathing. It has certain mechanisms or certain nuclei on the brainstem that allows for those early fear responses and modulation of it. For all intents and purposes, the middle part of the brain is responsible for emotions, and the top is attentional, regulatory, executive functioning. The work of a lifetime for all of us is to do two things: to learn to regulate our emotions and to consider others. That's the work of a lifetime. But it also turns out that the way the brain develops is not just because it's fun fact to know for Jeopardy, which, by the way, one day I would love to be on, if anybody knows. It actually dictates how we show up into spaces behaviorally as human beings. And what do I mean by that, practically speaking? What we are constantly asking: am I safe? Do you care about me? Or do you love me? And it is only when the first two questions are answered, am I safe and do you love me, that I can get to work. Bottom, middle, top. And to the extent that we understand this, and understand that this is how we show up, is the extent that we can appreciate and understand how those we serve are also showing up. If you've got that, you've pretty much got everything. So I started this conversation out. Love. Well, actually, I gave you the metaphor of a higher place, because that's where we're trying to get to. And I honestly believe that love is the highest place. So safety, as I said, is we need safety just as much as we need to breathe, as much as we need water. It is a basic function. But now I want to talk to you about the antithesis of safety. If safety is what we all require and mandate, I'm going to say the opposite or the antithesis of safety is fear. And I want to make a few connections because I don't want to make the assumption that we all have a shared working definition of what trauma is. So I want to offer one to you today. So if it's the antithesis, the one thing that I would ask is, or us to consider, is this idea that it's what I call a point of convergence, that we have all at some point in our lives been afraid or will be afraid. We understand what it feels like. We understand that it is something that does not always feel comfortable. It's necessary, that is fear and being afraid, until it's not. So I want to describe it in this way. We have all been afraid. It's a shared human experience. What we know from literature and multiple studies is that fear is a full brain and body response. It involves all of us, meaning it involves every part of our brain and many parts of our body. And I'll go into detail about this in subsequent slide. But what I simply want you to know about from this slide or to take away is that there are multiple parts. Now, I work at McLean, and I have a number of colleagues that spend a lot of time working on this small, it's not really even an almond, but the...
Ready to advance your coaching practice? Join the Institute of Coaching and tap into the world's leading resource for coaching science and professional development. With over 4,000 members across 130 countries, the IOC offers invaluable networking opportunities with an elite global coaching community and innovative learning to broaden your knowledge and keep you at the forefront of coaching best practices. Engage in cutting-edge learning events with world-renowned coaching scholars, from webinars and seminars to discussion groups, research projects, and more. Try any membership free for 30 days. Use promo code IOC Podcast and visit instituteofcoaching.org/join to get started.
Amygdala that's what it means in Latin. It's not an almond, though, when you actually look at it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the amygdala is a very well-studied midbrain structure that's responsible for fear conditioning and fear extinction. It's like the fear center. And it gets a lot of love, and it should. But it turns out that there are multiple parts of the brain that are involved in the fear response. While the amygdala kicks in very quickly, it turns out that there are multiple aspects. So I simply want you to know that there's a sensory aspect of fear, there's an emotional memory aspect of fear, there's a physiologic aspect of fear, and we'll tap into some of this. And then there is a cognitive attentional aspect of fear, meaning that there are multiple parts of the brain involved, multiple parts from top to bottom. And what we also know is that fear is designed to be both time and threat limited. So I've got another question for you. What do you suppose happens when this fear response, which is a part of our natural human proclivity towards survival, which is meant to be both time and threat limited, what do you suppose happens when this fear response... Oh, let me back up. One other thing. So I said that before I asked you the question, now you have a little more time to study. But before I posed the question, I'd said to you all that there's a physiologic aspect of fear. What we know is that when we are afraid, we are also stressed. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis also kicks in at this particular time, and that's the physiologic aspect. And so what we know for sure in my Oprah moment is that none of us were designed to be chronically stressed or chronically afraid. We just weren't. Bearing that in mind, let me get back to the question. What do you suppose happens when this fear/stress response, which is meant to be both time and sort of threat limited, does not quite turn off? You probably are asking me, but wait a minute, there are multiple trauma types, and you would be correct. I'm not talking about trauma types. There's geopolitical trauma, there's early childhood trauma, there's early adversity, there's all sorts of trauma types. What I am talking about more universally is the neurobiological underpinnings of trauma, which again tends to be more universal. That is how it impacts the brain and the body for literally every human, right? So here's what I want to say to you. One way, and I really want to underscore the one way, not the way, but one way for you to consider or to think about the neurobiological underpinnings of trauma is a fear/stress response that does not quite turn off. And that's going to be a key point. A book that I did, the subtitle of the book, The Trauma of Racism, is the people and systems fear built. It's the recognition that fear shows up in literally everything. If I was to ask you, are your practices and policies, or your organization's practices and policies built on your greatest hopes, or are they built on our greatest fears? And I would venture to say the latter and not the former. However, I'm holding out the hope that we can get to the former, where policies and practices are built on our greatest aspirations and hopes and not limited to our greatest fears. One way, because when we break it down, people talk about trauma-informed all the time. They say it's a good idea, but what we're really talking about is how we identify safety within systems, and I'm going to talk more specifically about that, where fear shows up, where stress shows up. When we're talking about organizations and workplaces, we are specifically wanting to break it down into palatable, meaningful, touchable parts. If we were to identify the places where we can increase safety, the places where there's preventable fear and stress, that which is preventable, we should prevent. That is just basic. And how we reduce, mitigate, and prevent further re-traumatization. And I'm going to talk about suffering, because trauma indeed is the science of suffering, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So again, my working definition, one way to think about traumatization or the neurobiological underpinnings is a trauma/stress response that doesn't quite turn off. Van der Kolk says it like this, because Van der Kolk has been around a long time. I've been doing this for 22 years. He's been doing it for way longer. But he says that traumatization occurs when both our internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with external threat. I just did that from memory. Come on, B12. Somebody say, come on, B12. That's okay. A lot of words, but what Van der Kolk basically is saying is what I'm offering to you, which is a fear/stress response that doesn't quite turn off, is one way to think about the neurobiological underpinnings. Are we all right with that? Because I'm going to move on and I'm going to come back to this. A few other sort of important notes. You all probably know our Surgeon General has said that one of the key threats to public health currently is what? Loneliness. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because it turns out that loneliness is a stress response. And I'm sure you all know that the prior speaker talked very much about connection, and that connection is important, and it literally is. So I am a double board certified addiction psychiatrist, and I work in that space. Gabor Mate says something that I think is really important, because it underscores and undergirds the significance of connection, and we cannot move away from it. And he says that the opposite of addiction is not abstinence. The opposite of addiction is connection. It's a true statement. And then another beautiful documentary where he is quoted as saying that we should not be asking why the addiction, and this is going to be relevant because I'm going to be talking about us and where some of the stress manifests itself as addiction, even in some of us who are trying to help do the healing. So he says that we shouldn't be asking why the addiction. We should be asking why the deep emotional pain. And so it's about these reframes and actively thinking about what connection means. So I'm going to speak to it. What we know from all of the literature, you look at loneliness, and actually, I think it's an 85 or 86-year-old study. It's the Harvard Development Study, where they have adult study, but it'll speak very, very beautifully to how important it is to be meaningfully connected versus being isolated. Because when we are isolated and alone, the way that our body and brain interprets it is like a traumatic response. It's like a fear/stress response. We're not designed to be codependent, independent, or dependent, but we are designed to be interdependent. And all of the literature suggests that loneliness actually dysregulates our stress response. It's problematic, and it has long-term sequelae for inflammation in the body and certain disease states and decreased immunity and all of those things. So that's one important point. The next important point I want to make is about exclusion. So I want to take you to, can we go to second grade? Is that too traumatic for you all? It's time to pick teams for kickball. Oh. And you don't get selected. How are we feeling, y'all? Honestly, how are we feeling? You're like, and if you always got picked, I'm not talking to you. It doesn't feel great, but you're probably asking me, you're probably saying, and it's okay because we're in community. You're like, that's just ridiculous, Alisha, but is it really? Because some of us are in situations where in your workplace where you are like the second grader on the field and you're not getting picked. Some of us understand what it's like to be alone and isolated, sitting in a cubicle with 60 other people and still feeling the loneliest you've ever felt. So here's the deal. Here's what we know for sure. It hurts. Yes, we have those responses. Some of us respond with our hands and not our words, right? Some of us say things like stupid. Some of us internalize. There's a lot of different feelings that we have when we are not included. And we can relate to that. Many of you could relate to what it feels like to not be included, to feel invisible. So here's what the literature says, that the same areas of the brain that light up when you and I have been excluded are the same areas of the brain that light up when we have broken a bone in our body. It is literally painful to be excluded. But let me go a step further. A study by Williams and Nida around circa 2011 was a simulated study. 5,000 folks, 5,000 participants. This is a large, powerful study. Simulated exclusion, or what we call ostracism, in this particular study. And after 3 minutes of simulated ostracism, participants had negative affect. They brought these participants back 6 months later. They still had some negative affect from that 3 minutes of simulated exclusion. Brought them back 12 months later, and they still had some negative affect from that 3 minutes of exclusion. So if we can imagine what 3 minutes of exclusion can do, I invite us to maybe pause for a moment and maybe consider, can you even consider a lifetime of exclusion? There are some among us, some of our colleagues, some of our neighbors, some of our community members who chronically are excluded. Now, this is something that we all can do something about. It's in our wheelhouse. We can include someone, and it goes beyond inclusion and belonging. There's a spectrum. Inclusion and belonging are on that spectrum. But can I share with you that you can belong to a place and still not feel like you matter? And it turns out that what folks are looking for, yes, I want to belong, but more than that, I need to matter. And so this is why this work becomes critical and important. As we think about trauma-informed work and what it includes, I wanted to give you the frame to make sure you had all the information, but this is also another part of baseline understanding. You all have heard about or will hear about. I'm just going to give it to you real quick here. We can't have a conversation about trauma without talking about Felida and Anda and colleagues in the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. But here's the thing. I want to talk about it because there's now a more complete model. So this particular study is seminal. And as you all probably know, well, let me ask. I don't want to make an assumption. You all knew that the original Adverse Childhood Experience Study, or ACE study, did you know that it was an obesity study originally? You knew that, right? Okay, it was originally an obesity study, and what they were finding is that participants would lose a certain amount of weight and then drop out. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because I think that these are the pieces that we miss about the original study that actually give window into where we are right now. Some things are new, but they're not really that new. So originally, what they found is that this group was dropping out. They began to have a conversation. They're like, first of all, this is too many people. It's such a huge group. We're talking about 17,000 plus people. And so as they began to have a conversation, and it kind of came organically, they wanted to better understand in this post hoc sort of analysis, what is going on? And it literally was a question, what's going on? And some of the answers that they were getting formulated the original Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, which has been updated, right? It's been improved over time. When we know better, we should always do better. And so some things that some of these participants were sharing was, there was one point in my life where I didn't have enough to eat. I had to wear dirty clothes to school, or my parents were divorced, or someone cursed at me at some particular point in my life, or there was someone in my family who struggled with addictions or mental health challenges, or there were days where, I didn't know, there was not connection. So it's very interesting because let me tell you what the demographics were. I don't want you to answer this, just answer it kind of in your own self. When you hear the word trauma, I bet an image comes up for you, for all of us. And there's no judgment. We check that at the door, the front door. But here's the thing. Here was the demographic of the original study. Of that 17,000 plus, over 75%, nearly 3/4 or 3/4 of the participants were white. They were college educated, they were insured, and they lived in San Diego, for God's sake. So, I love San Diego. Whoever's from California, I love California, went to school there, in Palo Alto. So, but here's the thing. Early on, Felida Anda and colleagues had already let us know that trauma is ubiquitous, that it impacts everyone, that trauma, and because it does, that trauma and healing must be everybody's business. So what we then find from this original study, and now that you understand the demographics and a little bit of background, is you can see what was drawn from this conclusion from the original adverse and childhood experiences study was that early adversity has implications for overall health, and it can have implications throughout the lifespan. That, in other words, that these early, and I'm going to say, in the absence of intervention and support, that they can result in things like chronic mental health conditions, substance use disorder, and chronic medical conditions. So we knew that, and can eventually lead to early death. But then, as time went on, there was an understanding that there were some pieces that, I won't even use the word missing, that maybe could strengthen the model. So 4 years later, after 1998, you get the Philadelphia ACEs. The Philadelphia ACEs included 1,700 urban Philadelphians, and it introduced into the literature what we call community-level adversity. And community-level adversity essentially included things like racism, discrimination, foster care, and as you can imagine, an economic instability, food deserts, all of these particular things. And interestingly enough, when you account for community-level adversity, adverse childhood experiences, or ACE scores, of course, are amplified. Comes as no surprise to anyone, because in conditions where there is chronic fear and chronic stress, of course, there's a possibility for chronic trauma. Then we get to the more complete model, which is the Rice model, which is in the middle. That's the one you see. This one doesn't include the Philadelphia ACEs, but you should know sort of historically if we're doing points, because the Philadelphia Adverse Childhood Experience Study was also a seminal study. So then you get to Rice here, the Rice model. And the Rice model essentially acknowledges what I think everyone has understood, and it didn't need an additional study. Please note that in the adverse childhood experience, you start from conception to death. Now, we don't have time to get into it, but the reason it starts from conception is because that's the literal point at which brain development starts. And it actually is quite significant and rather eye-opening. However, with the more informed model, Rice, we see that it starts preconception. Well, what do you mean? This is where we get into conversations about epigenetics and things like, which I like to think of as memory marks that's left in DNA that's passed down. So we talk about transgenerational trauma, things that are passed down. It includes the very powerful social construct of discrimination and racism, and its impact on literally DNA and mRNA, all of these things, how it impacts that process before you even, what's passed down from ancestors, what is passed down to folks that before they ever even have a say, interestingly enough, and then it gets to conception. I think it's actually hopeful, because what is suggested, and what many things have suggested in terms of where neuroscience is today, is that just as trauma can be passed down, healing can be passed down as well. And so there's a real tremendous opportunity to create trauma-informed spaces, which is why I'm on a one-woman mission to do, so that we get beyond this, that we can pass down the healing, that we get to start a new conversation, that we get to create new environments, and that the ability to do that rests within each of us here. And so then as we think about this model, again, underneath it all, when you pull up the hood of trauma, what you are hard-pressed to not find, but what you will likely find, is unmet need. And when I talk about it, this is everything that you and I need. We need food, water, shelter. We need safety. And it's not just psychological safety. We need financial safety, physical safety, spiritual safety. It's all of it. Oftentimes, the conversation ends at psychological safety. That's simply not enough. And then we get to love, and the original model from Maslow is belonging, but I would replace that with love and mattering. And then we are more likely to brush up against the edges of self-actualization, which I believe we all deserve. So we can't have a conversation about trauma without unmet need. And then this leads me to, I think, an important part of the conversation. If you look at trauma-informed principles, you have all of the things: safety, accountability is one that people really don't want to talk a lot about, but that is a part of the model. You have voice and choice, empowerment, transparency. One of the last things to be added to the principles were gender, cultural factors, and it becomes incredibly important to consider it because oftentimes it's those things, when they are not tended to, they create scenarios where people feel the most unsafe. When we talk about then trauma, which is the science of suffering, I don't think that we can have a conversation about it without talking about things like racism, discrimination, and phobias. And it's what I have come to call racism, that is, and other things like it, as forms of needless preventable suffering. And so there was a piece that I read by Winnicott, a very dense piece, and it's actually entitled Hate and the Countertransference. It's very profound. But here's what I gathered from it, is that racism is very much consciously denied, but subconsciously applied. Alisha, what do you mean by that? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had anybody tell you that you're amazing, but they don't treat you like it? There's your answer. And so, a part of the conversation about being trauma-informed and moving in that direction is not just understanding safety, fear, stress, its relationship to trauma, exclusion, and isolation, and we're going to get to love, but it is very much understanding, again, that which is preventable. So then it leads me to this. I've come because I oftentimes feel like, we don't have enough conversations about us, the servants, the givers, the wounded healers, which is an oxymoron, but is very, very real. So I want to just take a minute, and I want to talk with you about burnout, define it for you, that I want to say that I don't think it's ever appropriate to talk about burnout in the absence of talking about secondary trauma, because they oftentimes are co-occurring. What it leaves is folks not understanding fully what might be happening, and to the extent that we have a more certainty about what may or may not be happening is the extent that we can function a little better. So let me define burnout for you. In the literature, it's defined as occupational specific dysphoria. Ooh, I'm not diagnosing anybody. But it is a protracted psychological and physical exhaustion as it relates to one's work. When you are in front of people, Dr. Maya Angelou says very notably many things, but one of my favorites is, I am human, therefore nothing human can be strange to me. So if I'm in front of another human being, it means that there's such great exchange of energy, spiritual, physical, and I would imagine that you leave drained at the end of a day. And it doesn't always have to be a bad thing. It's just like, I am emptying my tank every single time. And that's just not sustainable. So what we find is that these particular situations, and you're like, I'm passionate about the work, and there seems to be some cognitive dissonance, but I am so darn tired. Just 3 key dimensions. You all probably are very aware of Maslow and colleagues and the burnout survey, but I want to highlight 3, just a few quick things about it, because I think they're important. So some of the dimensions are an overwhelming exhaustion. Just, I'm tired. Well, I'll get to that, because it's a different kind of tired. It's not, I'm just physically tired. It's more profound than that. It's feelings of cynicism. It's also feeling like you just can't ever be good enough or do good enough. And then there are these 6 characteristics, and I'm going to go through them rather quickly. These are the 6 things that lead greatly to burnout/occupational specific dysphoria. When there's more work than there are people. When there's lack of control. No voice, no choice. When there's insufficient recognition and reward. I don't care who you are, how great you are, everybody needs to know that they matter, that the work they are doing is important, that their presence is important, that their pain matters, their suffering matters, their joy matters. Every one of us needs that. And then unresolved conflict. When it is too great, it contributes to great burnout. We have to be in environments where we can appreciate conflict, we don't avoid it, but we lean into it and find our way forward. And then there's this idea of, I'm going to describe it this way. There's the room for optics and the room where it happens. And folks are like, when I'm not in the room where it happens, then I don't matter, and it leads to burnout, right? People want to be in the space. They want to know that even if you don't take my suggestion, I want to know that you're wrestling with it. I want to know that you've considered it. And then last but certainly not least, there is a values conflict. When the values of the job come in direct conflict or are not in alignment with your core values, it is more likely to lead to burnout. And then it leads us to, and again, I don't think we can talk about burnout without talking about secondary trauma. Also falls under this umbrella of trauma exposure response. And these are all the researchers in the area: Charles Figley, Sigvitney, Perlman, and McCann, James Conti. But really what it boils down to is what I would like to call secondary trauma. It means that you haven't directly experienced it, but you hear about it, you read about it, you see it. It is on the daily, you're inundated with it. And it is what I have boiled down to being chronically subject to the suffering of others, while you yourself also may be suffering. So that is secondary trauma. And it has symptoms that look like post-traumatic stress disorder, intrusive thoughts, avoidance, arousal, or negative emotions. It is a real thing. And here's what we get to with these trauma exposure responses, or secondary trauma. I will never forget, von der Noot-Lipsky contributed greatly to this body of literature, and von der Noot-Lipsky basically, it's encouraged reading. I would say pick up the book. I read it at least once a year, and I get something new every time. But von der Noot-Lipsky, like you, is sort of a coach, trainer, healer, describes, and I'm going to paraphrase very early in the book, where they are hiking with their loved ones, and they get to a peak. Everyone's looking over and appreciating how beautiful the sight is. But the first thing that von der Noot-Lipsky thinks about is, I wonder what would happen if I jumped. I wonder what would happen if somebody else jumped. And it was out of this painful, kind of ridiculous moment that we got the gift of trauma stewardship. Again, another oxymoron. Who wants to be a good steward over trauma? No, it's the recognition that it exists. It's the recognition that many folks are operating in chronic fear and stress, and it's not sustainable. So she gives us a framework, and this is one of the, it's called the trauma exposure response, and I'm just gonna read a few. That when we're exposed, and really what von der Noot-Lipsky's point is that being chronically subject to the suffering of others changes us fundamentally in ways that we may not even be conscious of. And so you get things like feeling hopeless and helpless, a sense that you can never do enough, chronic exhaustion, guilt, fear, addictions. And what we know is that burnout, occupational specific dysphoria / secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, it all means the same, similar things. It leads to compassion fatigue. Now, I'm going to test you a little bit. You only get 2 seconds. Calm means what? With, together. The root word pasio means what? That's right, to suffer. Good job, guys. So compassion literally means to suffer with. When we are burnout and when we have been exposed to secondary trauma or secondarily traumatized, it literally leads to a compromise in our ability to suffer with others. Now, here's the thing. I'm not going to read it to you. I just want you to appreciate it. I just want you to see that there are psychological, physical, spiritual symptoms of compassion fatigue. So this is not like I'm just physically tired. This is my soul is tired, right? And there's a lot of tired souls. But I've come with good news. Just as those things may lead to compassion fatigue, here's what we know that is helpful in a trauma-informed model. We know that compassion heals us. Now, this work done at Stanford, these are randomized controlled trials that looks at the benefits of compassion. And what we find is that compassion is not only beneficial to the recipient, but it is more powerfully beneficial to the giver. So what we see is that when we are compassionate, going back to what was going to undergird this is love, when we're compassionate, we become healthier. We have less psychiatric symptoms, we worry less, there's less rumination, and we are less lonely. So the question I ask is, are we working in conditions of fear and blame, or are we creating conditions where joy, work, and meaning are possible? I would say a life that's worth living is one where we could at least brush up against the edges of joy at least once a day. 2 days ago, I had some crispy bacon. It was delightfully crunchy and salty and it was heaven for about 15 minutes. And it was joy, pure joy. And so I invite you all to find ways to meaningfully brush up against the edges of joy at least once daily. It's important. It's important for the work. And then it gets us to kind of how that leads into practical spaces that we operate in or that we seek to influence. When the pandemic hit, and I heard someone say that we are in recovery, I would dare not call it post anything, but we are in various stages of recovery. And in this recovery phase, let me go back, even before the pandemic, you had a number of folks who basically said, I feel lonely, and I'm not really sure what to do about it. The pandemic hit, loneliness, it just amplified to varying degrees. And then you had folks saying, no, I don't want to call this the great resignation. I want to call this the great reevaluation. So you got folks moving closer to this concept of, I might die tomorrow. And it literally wasn't dramatic. It wasn't hyperbole. I might die tomorrow. And if I do, this is not how I want to live. So the reevaluation made a shift from, I don't want to be dealing transactionally with the people that I'm engaging with. I want to be more relational. I want to be more connected. I want to know that the people, matter of fact, the best example I can give, one of my colleagues had told me that their cat had surgery 2 weeks ago. I ran into the colleague and I said, how's your cat? And they're like, girl, you remember that? Yes, because you matter. And the experiences that you have matter, and I'm listening to you, and listening, by the way, is a form of love. So there are opportunities that we have to do this work more powerfully and more meaningfully and to help others around us do it as well, because what others need is what we also need. This is a study that was done at Stanford, and it was a listening session. A listening session. And I'm going to give it to you quick. This was done at the peak of the pandemic. They asked frontline workers. The question simply was, what do you need in order to survive this moment? And survival is a low bar, my friends. I get it. But here's what they shared. It turns out to be a powerful working frame for where we need to the direction that I'd like to encourage us all to move. They basically said, hear me. Basically, listen to me, understand, help me know that you're understanding at least what I'm attempting to say. They also said, protect me. Make sure I have all of the things I need to keep me safe. So the protective equipment, I really don't want to take this home to my family. Prepare me. If there's training and things I need to do the best I can, please make sure that I get that. Support me. And I love this one. I'm just going to read it because it says, provide support that acknowledges my human limitations in a time of extreme work and uncertainty. Please acknowledge that this is hard for me too, that there are human limitations on me too. I'm human, therefore nothing human can be strange to me. And then care for me. When you translate and you dig deeper into the literature, deep into the study, with Shanafet and et al. And colleagues, basically, what comes off the page is it's love me. So here's the answer. Hear me, protect me, prepare me, support me, and care for me. And then this idea of self-care. And I know that people think about it, it's like you should just take 1 day off, a mental health day, go get that root canal you've been putting off for 6 months, go take the cat to the vet, go to that appointment we haven't been to. And I'm saying that's wonderful. Please do that. But really, I would acutely redefine self-care as this. You and I have basic needs, just like the people that we serve, just like the systems that we serve. So my question is to you, do you have food, water, and shelter? Do you have safety? Are you loved? Do you matter? And not only are you concerned about making sure that you have all your basic needs met, but the organizations and people in which you serve with are also equally concerned. That is a more complete definition of self-care because it heavily leans into the importance of being meaningfully connected. So I want to offer just a few thoughts, and we're moving toward a close here, but as we think about what all of this means sort of tied together in a trauma-informed frame, this work of moving more compassionately, of understanding the importance of safety, not just for others, but for us, and identifying where fear and stress shows up, and maybe the spaces in which we can prevent it, are incredibly important. They come, though, with some structural pieces that have to be addressed. One is this idea of, if you're going to move to be a trauma-informed person, which, by the way, to the extent that we're already talking about changing people, me, myself, or you, yourself, we are already effectively engaged in a systems change conversation. If we think about ecological models, there's self, there's family, there's community, there's workplace. All of it matters, especially in a social safety model. So when we do this work and engage in this work, what we are looking for is mastery and not success. What do you mean? I was listening to a TED Talk from a Stanford colleague. I love Harvard, but I am a Cardinal at heart. Go Cardinal. Anyway, okay, so it was actually an art therapist who was giving this talk, and this was just a small nugget, and I'm like, well, this actually applies to the work that we're doing. And she was giving the example of archery, and saying that when you're doing archery, you're aiming for the mark, and when you hit it, that's success. So success is 1 for 1, and that's good, but it's not great. Then she went on to say, we're not looking really for success, we're looking for mastery, and if success is 1 for 1, then mastery is 7 for 10. That means that as we are, over time, that we want to get more accurate and better at hitting the mark, it is the recognition that we are going to have to miss it. And there has to be grace for the missing of the mark. Perfection keeps us almost free, and almost isn't good enough. I want us to be fully free. So I'm not asking for perfection, I'm asking for perfect commitment. There's a difference. We can all do that, especially in the cancel culture we live in, where if you don't hit that mark, you're gone. There has to be grace for the missing in trauma-informed spaces. So in this case, mastery over success. And then we talk about power circles. I was given this assignment by one of my colleagues. She said to me, and I'm very vulnerable here. Vulnerability is, I guess, a demonstration of how powerful you are or think you are. So I'm being very vulnerable. So that must mean I'm very powerful in my own mind, at least in my shower when I'm singing. Anyhow, this was an exercise that my colleague, mentor, now colleague, gave to me about 15, 16 years ago. And she asked me, and these are my answers. She said, Alisha, if you're going to be doing this work with organizations, you have to, she's like, power is like a dirty word. Nobody wants to talk about it, but everybody wants to know who has it or where it is. And so she says, if power is in the middle, in these concentric circles, I need you to put an X next to where you see yourself. And I said, well, I'm pretty much, I know I'm several concentric circles out. So that's where I put myself. And then she says, well, where do you think others would put you? So I'm going to put, because this is based on 360s, they put me right on the power. And I said, well, that's surprising to me, So, but what it brought about was this very transformative conversation. It is what I call the power gap, or the perception of power, or the power perception gap. There is where you think you are versus where others think you are. And to be open to that conversation is actually quite transformative. And this has been powerful conversations that CEOs have been able to have with frontline staff, that managers have been able to have with supervisees, and it just opens up the space and it gets us back to a shared kind of humanity. So I would say this power reconciliation gap conversation is a nice way to have the conversation that's less threatening and that's disarming. And I'm going to say to you that a rising tide does not lift all boats. What do you mean by that? What do I mean by that? I should probably reframe it to say, what would allow for the most among us to benefit or seize the opportunity of the rising tide? Well, I have a few questions. I want to know, do we all have the same boat? Do we have a life jacket? Do we know how to swim? I could go into a million questions that I have that I would like to ask before we even get to the rising tide, because I want to make sure that when we get to it, the most, not the least, but the most among us can seize the opportunity. So I would say that this is the real equity statement. This is the real equity question. What questions haven't I asked? What haven't I considered? Where are my dead spots? We have them. I bought a car because I had to. I'm a committed person, 25 years with the same bank, 25 years with the same insurance company, 23 years with the same husband. These things are important. I'm a committed woman. When I make a commitment, I'm with you. But my car broke down too many times, so I had to get a new car. Betsy just died on me. So I got this car, and it has dead spot technology. And so I'm like, oh, this is great. You know, I'm from Oregon. We have lots of bike lanes, so I'm always looking out for my biking friends. But it doesn't work that well. And no, I don't want to get sued or anything. I'm not saying what car I have. I'm just saying the technology in this car doesn't work so well. But then it got me to thinking, I'm in a car that has a rear view mirror, that has 2 side windows, and a back window. I've got all these views. I want you to not miss this point. I got all these views. And dead spot technology. And I'm still missing things. So there's an opportunity if we allow ourselves. We have to be just as willing to learn as we are to teach. That folks will tell us where the dead spots are. And we literally keep people and things alive. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I know they're counting me down. So let me finish this out real quick. So organizations, all I want to say is organizations like people can be traumatized. We know this. One of my mentors and friends, Dr. Sandra Bloom, incredible. She looks at organizations and organizational trauma, and her main point is that we have to move beyond looking at organizations as machines and look at them as living things that require nurturing. They are biocratic, and that organizations can be traumatized, and these are all the things that you see. Loss of basic safety and trust, loss of people, stressed communication, stressed people, unresolved conflict. But the good news is that organizations can also heal. And what we find, the key piece, is that when organizations are allowed to grieve. A segment called Good Grief says that sometimes we have to allow our hearts to break a little so that our spirits don't. There has to be room for grieving, and when there is, we do well. So I'll just mention this about mattering. I said to you all that to belong in a space is important, but it is not enough. That we need to matter, not just in our jobs, but also in our communities, in our families. That mattering is just as important as our need to eat and breathe. So I'll leave you with this, and then a few additional words, and then I'll close us out. One of the things that I encourage folks to do is this. I started out with a conversation about sort of love and safety. I don't have time for closing thoughts. One of the things that I encourage folks to do is I started this conversation out talking about safety. And safety is one of these really, really incredibly important things that we need to feel safe. That's how we thrive. That's how we tap into creative spaces, when we feel safe and when we are cared about. So one of the things that I encourage folks to ask, let me just ask you this. Has anyone ever asked you what you need in order to feel safe enough to do your job? Okay, if the answer was yes to that, great. Then the second piece is did they take that information and do something with it? That's great if you answered yes. Then the third is, did you turn around and do that for someone else? So if you didn't answer yes to any of those questions, here's what I want to encourage you to do. To take this question and take it back to your respective groups and people. And what we know from literature and the research that I do is that the more we talk about safety, the better we become at building the conditions for it. And I'll end with this, truly. MLK says this, that unarmed truth and unconditional love, that he believed that it would have the final say. And so do I. Thank you all for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaching Revealed, brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. You can learn more about the Institute on our website at instituteofcoaching.org. You can stay up to date with new episodes of our podcast by liking and following Coaching Revealed. You can also find us on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X with the handle Institute of Coaching. We also love hearing from our guests, so please reach out to us with thoughts you have on this episode and any questions you have about coaching. Until next time, this is Emily Tarani with Coaching Revealed.